When most players hear marking in Ultimate, they usually think about footwork, positioning, and good defense. But when no one talks about the actual rules of marking, and chances are you're probably breaking some of them without even realizing it. So let's start simple. When are you actually allowed to start the stall count? 15.a.2 answers this question. It states only the marker may initiate or continue a stall count. It may do so anytime a thrower has possession of a disc that is live or in play. Now, the misconception I usually see is when the receiver catches a disc and falls down, or even their momentum might take them out of bounds or into the end zone, and the mark doesn't start stalling until they either get back on their feet or back to the line. And I want to make it known right now, that is not the case. Because once again, the keywords are anytime a thrower has possession, and if we go to here to 3.j, it reads possession of a disc is sustained contact with and control of a non-spinning disc. Even the homie Mitch Dangler calls it out in a Reddit comment here, but no, you do not have to wait at all. You can literally start stalling as soon as they make the catch. So I'm just saying, if you're not paying attention and you're waiting for that receiver to land or for the new thrower to put the disc back into play, you could be missing out on some very crucial stall counts. Now, there are a few exceptions to this rule called out in 15.a.2.b because you can't do this directly after a turnover, when putting the pull into play, or after a travel's been called and no pass has been thrown. In those examples, you have to make sure that the pivot is set before you start stalling. Now let's stay on the same topic a bit, but now let's get into the pre-stall. So most of the time when I see people try to attempt a pre-stall, they go over to where the disc is, tap it, and then they start the countdown. But if we read 14.a.3, it does not have to be like that exactly. The second half of this rule is what we really care about, but it says after 10 seconds elapse, a defensive player within 10 feet of the disc may announce disc in, and then initiate and continue the stall count, but only if a defensive player has given audible warnings of 10 and 5 seconds to pre-stall. So you don't need to physically run over and touch the disc, and on top of that, any defensive player can do the counting as long as they audibly say 10 and 5. It's only after that count is done is when a defender within 10 feet of the disc has to announce disc in to begin the real stall. Just to be clear, if you didn't know, that number changed from 10 to 20 if the disc is at rest in either the end zone or out of bounds, and in these cases, you also have to audibly say 20. So we got when to stall, we got the pre-stall, but do you know about the delay of game rule? You might have seen or been in those scenarios where a turn just happened and the new offensive player is either standing away from or standing over the disc and not actually picking it up. Well, 14.a.5 goes into this rule to discourage this type of behavior if you want to enforce it. So instead of a pre-stall, a defender within 10 feet of the spot where the disc is to be put into play can announce delay of game and count down from 3 to 0. So if that offensive player doesn't stop delaying by the time you reach 0, the marker can then announce disc in and start stalling like normal. Now if they do stop, then you have to stop your countdown as well, and you can only start stalling like how we talked about earlier in 15.a.2. One last thing about stalls I want to mention is called out in this table from 15.a.5. Because when calls are made and interrupt the stall count, this table tells you what stall count plays come back in on. I specifically want to highlight contested fouls and violations as well as picks. These are probably the most common scenarios I see people mess up because you can only come back in on 6 at the highest. So if this happens to you as the mark and you got all the way up to stall 8, that's tough. You got to go back to stall 6, my boy. All right, now let's get into marking violations. There's 6 total, but there's probably only 4 major ones you really need to know. Starting with fast count, this is a pretty simple one. Like, we are not the Flash. You got to count in intervals of at least a second between each number. But I do want to use this violation to talk about how all the marking violations should be handled in general. It gets talked about here in 15.b.3, and it starts with the first sentence. When a marking violation is called, play does not stop. So let's get that straightened out right now so we don't have to keep on slowing down flow if we don't have to. From there, the violation must be corrected before the mark can resume the stall count. And then if we skip a little bit further down, it says if the mark resumes the stall count before the defense corrects the violation, it is another instance of the original marking violation which the thrower can call again. This also goes into 15.b.4 a little bit as well, because if the defense commits another marking violation in the same stall count before the thrower is in the act of throwing, then that thrower may either choose to call another marking violation or treat it as a general defensive violation. All right, let's go back to 15.b.3, but let's assume that the mark does correct the violation before stalling. In this case, the mark would resume the stall count at the last number said before the call, -1. If that doesn't make sense, there's a pretty clear example in the rule for you, but it would just go something like 1, 2, 3, 4.
Come on, dog, fast count.
3, 4, like so. All right, let's briefly talk about the next marking violation, vision blocking. I can't lie, in my almost 9 years of playing this sport, I have never ever seen this called in a game before, and you probably didn't know this existed either. It's really straightforward, called out in 15.b.9. If a marker deliberately blocks a thrower's vision, it is a vision blocking violation. I will say though, as a short man myself, I feel like I could always call this one, but I'm gonna let that one slide. All right, let's get into one that's a little bit more involved, but let's talk about disc space. When talking about this one, it reminds me of school dances, how they used to say you gotta leave room for Jesus. Even though we know that doesn't happen. But in Ultimate, you as the mark have to leave enough space for a disc to fit between you and the thrower. It's detailed here in 15.b.8, but if any part of the marker is less than that distance away from the torso, it is a disc space violation. It's called out that a line between any 2 points in the marker touches the thrower or is less than that disc diameter from the torso is also considered a disc space violation. This is the area in the rulebook where the straddle and wrapping marking violations are called out as well. These two are available to the thrower if you want to be more clear to the mark on what the issue is, but if you want, you can just say disc space. Another thing I do want to say, as a thrower, if these disc space violations happen to you, please stop pushing off with the disc. This isn't legal, just call the violation instead, because if you push me, These rules are going out the window and we might have to throw hands. The last marking violation I want to get into is everyone's favorite, double teams. Unlike in the UFA, this is something that you're not allowed to do, and it's talked about in 15.b.7. If a defensive player other than the marker is within 10 feet of any pivot of the thrower without also being within 10 feet of and guarding another offensive player, it is a double team. So similar to the pick rule, there's that same use of the word guarding, which is defined as being within 10 feet and reacting to an offensive player. So I have this clip here that got sent a while ago from the homie Kareem from one of the Egyptian Ultimate Leagues that will help visualize this a little bit more. But if we go ahead and pause at this frame right here, we can see that the thrower's teammate here is probably within that 10 foot to 3 meter range, but that does not give their initial defender any right to go ahead and double team and jump the thrower. Once again, she should be actively reacting to that guy. One little small detail about this is that you are still allowed to run through this thrower radius as long as you're simply trying to reach the other side. It even says here in the fine print right next to it that any ulterior motive to interfere with the thrower is not merely running, which means something like flashing your hand along the way can still be considered a double team. Alright, now you've seen the violations, you heard the rules, so next time you're out there, mark responsibly.